Republicans abroad, Democrats abroad, I should point out, didn't want to take part tonight. In Maine, in the United States, Aaron David Miller is a scholar at the Wilson Center. And in Israel, Mordechai Kadar is at Bar Ilan University. Thanks indeed to you all for being with us tonight. Now, Eric, we've talked about the rather controversial stuff that went on in Israel, but you would think that a trip to the UK would be a no-brainer. I mean, the special relationship and all the rest of it, but Romney managed to really rub the Brits up the wrong way, didn't he?
Well, first of all, you have to know that he was of course one of the reasons he became famous is that he was in charge of the Olympics in Salt Lake City. What is it, 20 years ago? I forget.
Long time.
And that the big news of that year was that he was the first person to make it successful financially and not to put the city into the red. But he said that the Olympics was disconcerting. But all he's been doing really has been repeating what the British media has been saying for the past month. They've been complaining.
But he said it on the day of the opening ceremony.
Well, there've been complaints. There've been one complaint after the other, and the final complaint was that the stadiums are empty, or some stadiums are empty. And I think he should have his say.
All right, Aaron David Miller, what's your take on that?
My take is that the guy isn't thinking before he's talking, and I think it may be a testament to the fact that he hasn't had a lot of experience handling a variety of issues, which are complex. But here again, you've got a guy who presumably understands the limitations, the challenges of what it is required to put together an international event which is as complex as the Olympics. You would have thought, given the fact that he's there in the capital of literally America's closest ally, at a time when Britain is feeling incredibly positive about its own self-image, regardless of how this Olympics actually turns out, that he would have been a tad more sensitive and politic on this issue. So, again, not fatal. And frankly, in the end, I would argue not even relevant. Back to the main event here. The reality is, with 8.2% unemployment, a majority of Americans convinced that the country is moving in the wrong direction, this election is not going to turn even on the perceived competency of either candidate with respect to foreign policy. So this was a very political trip, designed to be orchestrated and stage managed in a way that was to be flawless. It didn't quite come out that way, but in the end, it's not going to matter. Turn or fall on whether or not Americans are prepared to answer two questions. Number one, is the guy in the White House responsible for my misery? If the answer to that is yes, then they'll ask themselves the second question. Is his opponent capable of addressing my misery? And if enough people answer yes to both questions, we'll have a new president.
Well, it is looking like a tight race if you believe the opinion polls. Christopher Dickey, he managed to not only upset the British, he upset the British Conservatives. I mean, the Republicans and the Conservatives are supposed to be natural bedfellows, aren't they?
Yes, I love David Cameron's remark that the Salt Lake City Olympics were nowhere. Where's that? Nowhere. And then there was a headline in one of the papers that described Mitt Romney as the nowhere man. But, I do think that whole flap was kind of unfair to Romney, to tell you the truth. Disconcerting, that's certainly not the most pejorative word that was ever used. And I think that Aaron, who's always the voice of reason, was right. People jumped on this for various reasons because the Brits are feeling so proud of themselves right now, and anything even slightly negative was something they could go after. And the tabloids had fun with headlines like Mitt the Twit, but it isn't going to make a big difference.
It's interesting if you compare Romney's tour to Obama's pre-election tour back in 2008. I mean, everybody remembers the crowds in Berlin, huge adoring crowds. I mean, Romney would only dream of that, wouldn't he?
Well, the left gets better coverage by the mainstream media. and a lot.
But it wasn't the media; it was the people. It was the
the
people out on
people
the
who read the
streets.
media and who never hear about who read about every mistake that George W. Bush said, but who never hear that when Obama
I think
mentions
the
the
Iraq
57
War probably has
states.
something to do with it.
Mentions the
That's not
57
just a
states.
gaffe.
Yeah, he doesn't mention the 57 states that Obama mentions, or when he gave a gift of 20 DVDs to Prime Minister Gordon Brown, or an iPad to the Queen filled with his speeches. I mean, come on, if that had been George W. Bush or Romney or McCain or Sarah Palin, every American would know about it. Because it's a leftist and Obama, the mainstream media ignores it or puts it on page 20 in the bottom paragraph.
I wonder if it's the opposite situation in Israel. Perhaps you can help us with that, Mordechai Kedar. Do the Republicans get an easier ride in the Israeli press, or is it the Democrats?
Well, depends which press, because Israel is divided very sharply between leftist media and right-wingish. So definitely the right-wingish media wasn't much in favor of Mitt Romney. But just to combine the two items, apparently the road to Washington, D.C. goes through Jerusalem and not as much as through London.
What do you make of that, Chris?
Well, I think that Mordecai is probably right. Certainly not through London. That's not going to change many votes. Whereas if in Jerusalem, Romney was going after money and a very concentrated, very committed electorate in the United States that identifies very closely with Israel, and which Obama has not done a very good job of courting over the last 4 years. So I think it was a smart move for Romney to go to Jerusalem, and in that sense, I think Mordecai is probably right. One of the fascinating things about American and Israeli politics is how deeply interwoven they are, where it was a little bit clearer when you had a Labor-Likud split, but in those days, you could see the Labor Party deeply identified with the Democratic Party and its candidates, and vice versa. Bill Clinton campaigned for Shimon Peres in the 1990s. And you can see the Likud party identified very closely with the Republicans, especially with the neoconservative part of the Republican Party. And to some extent, that's still playing out. You certainly see that Likud Republican identification. On the Democratic side, it's a little fuzzier now with Kadima and the breakup of the Labour Party.
And what about in Europe? What about the identification here in Europe? I mean, do you think the Republicans and the Conservatives still have things in common, for example?
Yeah, I do, but I think that, generally speaking, the political spectrum, at least in continental Europe, is so far to the left that often the Republicans have a little problem figuring out what to make of it. I think certainly in Britain, you would think that the Tories and the Republicans would have a natural rapport. But at the end of the day, it often comes down to personalities and always to specific interests and issues. And Cameron and Obama have gotten along very well.
Aaron David Miller, if I could bring you back in. There's been some comment that Obama is gentle in word but aggressive in deed. I mean, if you look back at his foreign policy achievements over the past few years, I mean, of course, he has made long speeches in the Middle East, but he managed to deliver Osama bin Laden. He's ended the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan again. This seems to be at odds with the criticism he gets of being friendlier to America's enemies than he is to America's foes.
Well, first of all, that criticism exists on the margins. I mean, the whole notion, and let's be clear here, this has been a relatively competent foreign policy at a time when the American public is focused on not re-engaging in discretionary wars, but extricating themselves from them and from the terrible losses. 6,000 Americans dead in Iraq and Afghanistan, over $1 trillion expended and counting, and an incredible loss of American credibility. This president, and again, I have been extremely critical of him in many respects, but with respect to foreign policy, Barack Obama is a man of his times. There has been no spectacular failures in his policy and no spectacular successes. And the fact is, that's exactly what American priorities call for at the moment. The notion, and one of your guests expounded it. I mean, I worked for a half a dozen secretaries of state, from George Shultz through Colin Powell, Republicans, Democrats, the notion that somehow the American people care, and or that in fact there is truth to the fact that Barack Obama doesn't believe in American exceptionalism, that he's an apologizer in chief. I mean, these are comments made by Republicans who frankly are trying to figure out a way to differentiate themselves from the current president, when in fact, on most issues regarding matters of peace and war, there is a high degree of coincidence that exists in actual policy terms between Romney and Barack Obama. And look, again, it's silly season. Campaigning is one thing, governing is quite another. One final comment. The notion that the road to the White House lies through Jerusalem I'm not even so sure how to respond. I mean, yes, it is important in an election year to ensure that if you're a Democratic president, that part of your Democratic base, the 5.5 million American Jews, most of whom identify with Democrats, they're not single-issue voters, and are going to vote for Barack Obama regardless of what his policies on Israel are. But the notion somehow that this is needless, gratuitous pandering. This is how American elections are done. The Israelis are a part of the domestic landscape, but the notion that this election is going to be determined by what American Jews think or don't think about Mitt Romney or Barack Obama, I think is validation, frankly, of one of those darker tropes tropes that I'd rather not see in such a conversation.
I think that Aaron's exactly right, that it won't be decided, but the actual question was whether it went through London or went through Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is more important to the American body politic than London is.
Right, okay, all right.
He's a really smart guy, but he would also answer that question. The road to the White House probably runs through neither.
All right. Anyway, a lot of points there for you to respond to, but namely the criticism, as I mentioned, often levelled at Obama is that he's made America's enemies feel safer and its friends feel less safe. As we've just heard, Aaron David Miller doesn't agree.
I think Romney also went to Warsaw, and in Warsaw he met with Lech Walesa, who Obama did not want to meet with. You know, he meets with Putin, he meets with Medvedev. He talks to them friendly, you know. His friendly talks with them are captured on microphone. And then when he has to give a medal to a Polish American hero from, I think he was American, I'm not sure, maybe he's just Polish, from World War II, he says we do not want, well, he or the Obama White House says we do not want the Lech Walesa to come here. And they're both Nobel Peace Prize winners, you know, except I think Walesa did a lot more than Obama did when he won his. And Walesa has come out for Mitt Romney. Of course he has, because Obama loves to talk to Medvedev, to Putin, and then he drops the Eastern Europeans, all because he believes in this. Again, in this fairy tale where, if we're all friendly to each other, everything will be cool and Americans will be loved by the foreigners.
Yeah, he was really friendly to Osama bin Laden.
Yeah. And they've just found out that three times he said
no.
It was only on the fourth time that they suggested he killed him that he agreed.
You mean when they thought he could do it and when they did do it?
Let's talk about the Polish trip, because that was about Romney standing up to Russia, wasn't it? That was partly to show solidarity with the Poles. There's a large Polish-American vote in the US, but it's also about standing up to Russia.
I think it was about a large Polish-American vote in the United States is what it was about.
Well, it's excuse me, but isn't it also about...
Hey, wait, I think you've had it. Please.
One at a
You've
time.
interrupted me, but that's okay. Go ahead.
You'll get your say.
Please.
No, go ahead.
We're running out of time, gentlemen, so one at a time, please.
It was about the Polish-American vote. It's the whole trip was about domestic votes in the United States on the margins in an election that's going to be very close. So, and he doesn't need to make a show of standing up to the Russians or the former Soviet Union with his conservative voters, because they all believe this line that's being parroted right here, that somehow Obama's been apologizing to the world for being an American. But he does need to consolidate support among Catholics and especially among Poles, and that's what he was doing.
Well, it's not only that, it's also Russia's attitude. And it's not only American conservatives who believe that these people who are clueless. It's also the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, etc. Now, in the past, one of the previous idiots among the Republicans before W. Bush and before Mitt Romney and before Sarah Palin was Ronald Reagan. Strangely enough, there's been a second statue put in up of Poland of an American president. It's Ronald Reagan. There's a statue of Ronald Reagan in Hungary, in Budapest. There's one in Prague. And it's very strange that they don't put up the statues to Jimmy Carter or to Barack Obama. Maybe they think that the people who talk with strength to the Russians, to the Russian bear, know better what the reality is, and don't believe in the leftist fairy tales.
All right, Aaron David Miller, just briefly before we go, do you think this trip has helped or hindered Romney?
Yeah, and I think it's I think basically it's a wash. Among key constituencies, he may pick up a few votes, but in the end, it's not going to be determinative. I might point out also your guest is talking about who's putting up monuments to whom. There's also no monument to George H.W. Bush. I might add, probably the last time we had an effective.
No, there's one to Ronald Reagan.
That's
precisely the point.
That's right. So don't.
That's precisely the point.
You mentioned Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama, Democrats, who I'm assuming you think are weak apologists. But just keep in mind that Ronald Reagan's successor probably managed the most effective foreign policy that the United States has had in the last 20 plus years.
Except when he failed to take down Saddam Hussein, which would have avoided a whole lot of problems in the following years.
All right.
During the Gulf War in 1991.
Gentlemen, I'm sure we could go on all night, but we've run out of time. Aaron David Miller, thank you very much indeed. I'm terribly sorry to cut you off. Very interesting to hear your point of view there. Aaron David Miller, Eric Svein, Christopher Dickey, and Mordechai Qatar, thank you very much indeed to you all. Thanks to you for watching. That's it for tonight's debate. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow.